It's a cold, dreary Saturday afternoon in December, which is the perfect time to stay inside and work on my upcoming video game, Dark Frontier. I want to create a ranged attack enemy type today. Right now we only have melee enemies in the game, and I think this is the perfect opportunity to introduce some new variety to the core mechanics by allowing for our enemies to shoot at us. Got to pet the pupper before we start up the computer. So the first thing I need to do today is create an animation for the ranged attack that the enemy will be using. I went to itch.io to look around for some asset packs that I could maybe purchase or use as inspiration and didn't really find a whole lot. So I just decided to make this from scratch today. I'm not the best pixel artist, but I am learning, and I think that we can use this for now until we get something better or I improve my skills going into the future. Okay, it's the next day. I was pulled away yesterday for some errands, but I did manage to work a little bit more on the sprite for the actual bullet projectile that the enemy is shooting. I'm not exactly thrilled with it, but it is at least usable. And at some point in the future, I can either, continue to practice my pixel art skills and make something I'm more happy with, or even contract it out, or maybe find a different asset that is better suited for the game. But for right now, this is what I've got, so we're going to continue forward with it. And I know it's not perfect, at least not to me, but it's going to have to do. The next thing we need to tackle is the actual code with which the enemy will use to make the ranged attack. And just like we do for the player, we're going to have to flip the actual shooting point for the enemy across the x-axis whenever the enemy flips its direction so that it lines up visually with where the gun is for the enemy. All right, so I've gotten our new ranged enemy created. Now, I went ahead and made a different entity here from our regular base enemy to differentiate the ranged enemy, just because their state machines are going to be different and there's going to be different things that they need, like, for example, the shooting point that denotes where the projectile will spawn from and the bullet pool that's attached to the ranged attack in order to reduce load time. As you can see here with our base enemy, we just have a melee attack on their state machine and the ranged attack isn't present. That's how I'm differentiating what they can actually do and perform as part of their operations. So we have this wonderful sprite work from Pen USB Mic loaded up here, and I'm able to, if I disable some of these collision zones, you'll be able to see it a little bit easier. Let's go through some of these animations together. So first up, we have the death animation. Poof. Pretty cool. We don't want that to loop. I'm going to go ahead and change that now. And then we have the idle animation. He's just sitting there puffing some air. And the most important one for today, the shoot animation. So as you can see here, there's actually a good bit of muzzle flash already baked into the animation. So I want to kind of get the bullet to be right about central to that flash. So if we stop right here, somewhere in this white zone, slightly in front of the gun, will spawn the projectile. So as you can see, I've got the shooting point here. We probably need to adjust that slightly. So let's go ahead and move it. Oop, don't want to select that. Let's go back to the shooting point and I'll click move. And then that way we get our nice little drawing. Probably right about there. That looks to be in line with the gun and exactly where I'm looking to spawn the projectile. So that's perfect. And then we can reference this in our ranged attack script here shortly in order to actually generate the projectile from the bullet pool. Okay, so here's the start of our ranged attack script. I just have some variables declared now that we're going to need in order to actually create this, like the bullet pool I was referencing earlier that we'll use to spawn the bullets and the shooting point, as well as alternate states that we can transition into or out of, and some variables that we use to track the animations as well as when we can actually make the ranged attack. All right, our ranged attack enemy is implemented. So let's take a look. Now, he shoots really quick, and his animation isn't exactly lined up with when the projectile spawns, which I need to fix. That's just a timing issue with what I have the variables set to. You can also see that when he shoots, like if I kind of walk beside him and underneath him, it takes him a little bit to flip sides. So let's go over the code. Okay, so let's start with the enter function. This gets called whenever a player enters the attack zone, which is this big collision shape here. So it's 100 pixels wide right now for this enemy. And once we enter that attack zone from the chase or the stun state, it will allow us to start a ranged attack. So we call super just to set up the actual state machine, and then we have our attacked variable that is being set to false. That just tracks whether or not the enemy is actually attacked yet this cycle. So we just want to make sure that that's reset. Then we have a check here to just ensure that our parent is of type enemy, to make sure that these values exist and we don't, have any errors. And then we just set a whole bunch of our starting values to whatever the parent enemy type displays. So that way we can use our resources to set these, and we don't have to set these individual values every time we have a new type of enemy. So with that setup out of the way, after we enter the new state, then we go down to the process physics function, which runs every frame. And we start by making sure that the enemy is actually alive. And then we increment the attack timer and attack delay by delta, which just gets the time between this frame and the last frame and allows us to smooth anything over with real time and not be dependent on the frame rate of the system. Then we play our shoot animation, and we again type check to make sure that we are on an enemy, to make sure that these values exist and we don't have any errors. And then we're going to flip the sprite as well as flip our shooting point to the other side across the x-axis. So next up here, we're going to see if it's been enough time for us to make a new attack. And then if it has been, we're going to create a new bullet and give it a direction towards the player from our current shooting point. And then we're going to set some statistics for the bullet based on our parent's attack damage and shot speed. And we're going to make sure it's not hidden. And then we're going to set our attack variable to true, which just lets us know to reset essentially these delays that we have in place and these timers so that we can start attacking again, which we will get into now. So if the attack timer is less than or equal to 0, we are going to return the chase state if the player is outside of our current range. And if not, then we're going to attack again. So we're going to reset the attack timer and delay, and then make sure attack is set to false. And then lastly here, we just check to see if we have been stunned, which triggers whenever we are shot. And if so, then we'll go to the stun state and interrupt what we're doing here. All right, so here we have the instance of enemy bullet, which is the projectile that the ranged enemy is shooting. So we can go ahead and set this texture to be our new projectile that we've created. And so I can just do that by clicking on here. We're just gonna do a quick load, and I'm going to type in the name. So this would be enemy projectile.png. So we'll open that up. You can see, whoa, it's a little messed up. So that's because Godot doesn't actually know that this is an animation with the sprite sheet. So we got to set some frame options here. So this has a 4-frame animation right now. So we just set this H frames, which is horizontal frames, to 4 and click enter. And just like that, we now have our one image. So it can now differentiate between these as individual parts of the same animation. All right, so let's take a look at the final product. So I've got the animation synced up now. It looks so much better. And I think, honestly, this looks really good. I'm pretty happy with this, especially for the time being. I think that there's definitely some polish we can do here to make it a little nicer. But we have a ranged enemy implemented, and I think like just shooting at the player's current direction is probably the best move, because there's going to be other things like, yes, I can kite him in a circle, but there will be other enemies spawning on the map. So I'll have to, really take this into account, and it punishes the player for standing still for too long. I might add in like, currently on the player's weapon, there's some accuracy that's built in that kind of modifies the gun to shoot in like slightly random directions. So I might add something like that to the enemy here as well, just to kind of make it a little bit more exciting. Well, that's all for today's video. I hope that you enjoyed it. I know game development isn't always glamorous, but hopefully you learned something and had a good time doing so. Thanks. I'll catch you in the next one.